Roman Catholicism gets all the press when it comes to demons and exorcism, but the Jewish faith has a very long and rich tradition of demonology and exorcism too. Thankfully, this is starting to get some recognition in some pretty great horror movies, and one of the best is The Vigil. Our protagonist is Yakov, whom we meet as a member of a small support group for what we might call recovering Orthodox. Given the film's mystical theme, it's safe to say they are more specifically Hasidic Jews who lean much more into the mystical strain of Judaism as expressed in the practice of Kabbalah and its main text, the Zohar. These folks have all left the Hasidic life and community and have formed this group to hash out the challenges they're facing in transitioning from the insular Hasidic lifestyle and navigating the outside world. This meeting sets the tone for the whole rest of the movie, as the main topic of conversation is not being stuck in the past and being able to move forward with one's life. One of the main topics of conversation in this meeting is why Hasidism and its spiritual leaders, the Rebbes, tried so hard to protect these folks from the influences of the culture beyond their community. But as we and Yakov are going to learn, there's more than enough to defend oneself from, whether it's in the everyday world or in the world unseen. Yakov is brand new to this transition. He left the Hasidic faith and way of life after his little brother Baruch was killed in an accident that happened when some fools manhandled him on the street and cut off his sidelocks. In the scuffle, Baruch fell into the street and was fatally struck by a car. Sidelocks are an identifying characteristic of Orthodox and Hasidic Jewish men in obedience to the mitzvah or commandment found in the book of Leviticus, chapter 19, verse 27. You shall not round off the hair on your temples or mar the edges of your beard. So these guys' targeting of Baruch's sidelocks is a specific attack on his Jewishness. And this is one reason why Yakov has left the Hasidic faith. He blames the religion itself for causing Baruch's death, because if he and Baruch didn't look so different than everyone else, if their faith didn't set them apart visually, they wouldn't have been targeted and Baruch would still be alive. Yakov shaves off his own sidelocks because sidelocks provided a target and because they represent the essence of who he was at that time. He leaves Hasidism because he hates himself for not defending his little brother, and he leaves because essentially the whole event caused him to lose his faith in God. And now he, like the others in this small support group, is trying to be just like everyone else. But is that necessarily a good thing? Yakov tells his friends that he's having a very hard time landing a job, and as a result of that financial strain, he has to choose between buying medication or buying groceries. Of course, he's on the medication as a way to cope with the grief and the crushing guilt of his brother Baruch's death. And later in the movie, we learn that Yakov had even been hospitalized for this emotional trauma at one point. But with perfect timing, one might even say divine timing, Yakov's old Rebbe, Shulam, approaches Yakov with a bit of a gig. Shulam will pay Yakov several $100s to sit shomer for a deceased member of the community, Reuben Litvak, for one night. The Rebbe is very upfront with Yakov that he's offering Yakov this opportunity as a way of bringing Yakov back into the fold, so to speak. Yakov is, of course, resistant to accept this offer, as he's trying really, really hard to get away from anything having anything to do with religion, but the promise of the badly needed money convinces him. He agrees to be the shomer for the night. The word shomer comes from the Hebrew verb shamar, meaning to watch or to keep. And in Jewish tradition, a shomer is someone who keeps watch by the body of a deceased person through the night following the person's death. Jewish belief holds that the dead must be buried as soon as possible, preferably by the following day. Particularly within the mystical strain within Judaism, the soul's return to its source, God, is bound up with the body's return to its source, the earth, as Genesis chapter 2 verse 7 says that man was created by God from the dust of the earth. So the Shomer's watch is for only that one night between the time of death and burial the following day. There are various reasons for having a shomer, among which are simple care and love for the deceased person, and especially in the old days, keeping rodents at bay. But in this movie, the most important of the shomer's functions is that of guarding the body of the deceased from any malignant spirits that might try to come in and fill the space left by the departure of the soul. With the soul absent from the body, both soul and body are in a vulnerable state. The soul is unmoored from its material home and is therefore disoriented and can be confused, and the body is simply an empty vessel. By being vigilant in prayer throughout the night, the shomer defends both soul and body and keeps at bay any evil forces that might try to take advantage of this situation to harm the deceased. On the way to Reuben Litvak's house, Shulam tells Yakov that the deceased man was a Holocaust survivor. But what Yakov doesn't know is that during Reuben's time in the Buchenwald concentration camp, he had been forced by an SS officer to execute a fellow prisoner. This fellow prisoner may have even been a relative of Reuben's. Rebbe Shulam tells Yakov that Reuben had lost his entire family in the Holocaust, and he alone survived to come to the United States and start a new family there. But the effects of this long ago event literally followed Reuben from Europe into the new life that he tried to begin after the war. His trauma and guilt from ending the life of an innocent person drew the attention of an ancient demon known as a Mazzik that latched on to Reuben and tormented him every day for the rest of his life. The word Mazzik is not from Hebrew, but from Jewish Babylonian Aramaic, common between the 4th and 11th centuries AD, and means harmful one. Now, you might be familiar with the term Dybbuk for a Jewish demon, chiefly due to the infamous Dybbuk box and the 2012 movie The Possession, which features a Dybbuk along with its box. But a Dybbuk is the soul of an evil deceased person. The Zohar, the main text of mystical Judaism, or Kabbalah, dating to the 13th century AD, says that, similar to a Dybbuk, a Mazzik can be the spirit of an evil deceased person. But the much earlier Babylonian Talmud, a magisterial collection of rabbinic commentaries on the scriptures and Jewish law dating from the 3rd to the 6th centuries AD, and preserving traditions that go back even further in time, defines Mazzikim, that's the plural of Mazzik, as spirits that were never human to begin with. They came into being on the evening prior to the first Sabbath, in a liminal period between day and night, after all other created things had been established. So they are creatures outside the bounds of God's created order. The Mazzik in the Vigil wouldn't allow Reuben Litvak to enjoy a single moment of his life. He became estranged from his children and grandchildren, and eventually he never even left his house. The Mazzik wouldn't allow him to leave and find companionship outside his home, which might have helped him to cope with his grief. Our friend Yakov is unknowingly walking right into a home where the Mazzik that tormented Reuben Litvak has been set loose by Reuben's death. And Yakov's own consuming guilt over his little brother's death makes him its next target. When Yakov and Rebbe Shulam arrive at the Litvak home, they're greeted by Reuben's widow, who, upon first setting eyes on Yakov, demands that he leaves the house, saying he won't work. She can see by his hair and clothing that he's not Hasidic, at least not anymore, and though she doesn't say it, she's actually trying to do him a favor by preventing him from being exposed to the Mazzik, because he has zero spiritual defense against it. However, Rebbe Shulam talks her into letting Yakov stay. Shulam leaves Yakov to his task with an invitation to come to synagogue for morning prayer when Yakov's vigil ends at dawn. Yakov begins the evening by sticking his earbuds in, putting some mild techno on, and searching how to talk to women on his brand new phone. He's not being naughty here. He's begun striking up a friendship that could possibly lead to something more with a woman named Sarah in his support group. But because men and women are so strictly separated in Hasidism, he's uncomfortable having even a basic conversation with her. Now, he's supposed to be praying this whole time, not messing around on his phone and listening to techno music, so he's neglecting the spiritual component essential to being a shomer. He's thoroughly immersed in the world. Noises upstairs seize his attention, shifting his focus from the material world of phones and techno into the spiritual realm where the Mazzik holds sway. A few minutes later, Yakov starts texting his friend Sarah again, and all of the lamps in the house immediately go crazy. And at that point, Yakov gets off of his phone and into his prayer book, and finally, after about an hour, starts reciting the Psalms, albeit in a very lackluster way. But each supernatural event that occurs throughout the night pushes Yakov ever more slightly towards some element of his old faith. When the spiritual activity really ramps up, poor Yakov thinks that he's experiencing a mental breakdown and calls his psychiatrist, greeting the doctor by saying, Baruch Hashem, meaning blessed be God. This is another indication that Yakov is coming back to his roots in Hasidism. By little things, step by step, he's being gradually brought back. The unsettling events in the house eventually lead Yakov to the basement. Because, of course, the basement, right? And there he finds that a recording of Ruben Litvak is already playing on a TV. On the recording, Ruben explains that he's making this tape in order to help the next person targeted by the Mazzik. He describes the Mazzik as a spirit whose head is turned backwards, staring into the past forever. It therefore afflicts the memory and keeps a person trapped in the guilt of the past. Now, this is not part of the characteristics of a Mazzik in any of the rabbinic literature. However, it's not outside the realm of possibility that there could be a particular Mazzik that is like this. Think along the lines of something akin to Christian demonology, where specific demons have particular characteristics. For example, certain demons specialize in envy, certain others specialize in wrath. Maybe a particular Mazzik could specialize in afflicting the memory and keeping a person trapped in guilt. On the tape, Ruben explains that the Mazzik operates by chewing down through the 5 essences of the human person, according to the Kabbalah. First, the nefesh. This is the animating force that makes the body function in the world. This includes, most importantly, the ability to observe God's commandments. Genesis chapter 2, verse 7 says that Adam became a nefesh when God breathed life into him. The nefesh, however, is so bound up in and with the body that it dies when the body dies. The second essence is the ruach. This comes from the Hebrew word for spirit or breath, one word for both things. This is the faculty of the emotions. It allows a step up from simply observing God's commandments to observing them with love from the heart. The third essence, neshama, is the rational capacity that facilitates mystical contemplation of God as the creator of all things from nothing. Chaya, the next essence, is also contemplation, but it's higher than neshama, involving knowing and experiencing God not only as creator of material things, but as transcendent, not bound by his own creation, living and existing beyond space and time. The Chaya is that part of the human person that can know absolute truth and become fully united to God through contemplating God. And finally, the Yechida, that part of the human soul that is always bound directly to God. The Mazzik operates by chewing its way through every one of those 5 essences. Ruben says on the tape that the way to defeat the Mazzik is to burn its true face on the first night it appears before dawn. If that is not done, the Mazzik will never leave the person. Grief and guilt must be reckoned with immediately, or memory will devour the soul. Because Yakov must defeat the Mazzik before dawn, he has no choice but to seek it out in the house and confront it directly. To assist him, Mrs. Litvak gives Yakov her husband's tefillin. These are items worn by Jewish men during the set times of weekday prayer, particularly in the morning. And tefillin are small boxes containing miniature scrolls on which are written specific verses from the books of Exodus and Deuteronomy. The first is Exodus chapter 13, verses 1 through 16, commanding Jews to remember that God liberated their ancestors from slavery in Egypt, and to consider this as their own liberation from slavery, and to pass this knowledge on to their children. The second is Deuteronomy chapter 6, verses 4 through 9. This is the great Jewish prayer known as the Shema. Hear, O Israel, the Lord is our God. The Lord is one. And the third passage contained in the tefillin is Deuteronomy chapter 11, verses 13 through 21, promising reward for the righteous who observe God's law. Literally wearing on one's person the words of God's commandments is in obedience to a mitzvah found in the book of Deuteronomy chapter 8, verses 6 through 9, in which Moses tells the Israelites, "Keep these words that I am commanding you today in your heart. Bind them as a sign on your hand, fix them as an emblem on your forehead, and write them on the doorposts of your house and on your gates." Each passage written upon the tefillin scrolls contains this same command to bind the words of God's law on the forehead and on the hand. The command to bind the words of God's law on the forehead and on the hand is probably a poetic way of saying never forget the commandments for a single moment. Keep them constantly at the front of your mind. But these words are taken very literally in Orthodox Judaism. When Mrs. Litvak hands the tefillin to Yakov, she tells him that her grandfather saw his own parents murdered before his eyes, and yet he prayed with talis and tefillin every day. A talis, or talit, is often known as a prayer shawl and traditionally is worn by Orthodox Jewish men during times of prayer. It was when he was truly at ease with the world, she tells Yakov, and with himself. Mrs. Litvak has shown Yakov a vital distinction. Her grandfather, who was never troubled by a Mazzik despite his trauma, took his pain to God, whereas her husband Reuben and Yakov have held their pain away from God. Yakov straps on the tefillin like a warrior putting on the armor of a fallen comrade. He's using Reuben's tefillin, Reuben's armor, which Reuben himself could not employ in order to do battle with the Mazzik. Yakov enters this battle reciting the Shema, which is key to defeating Mazzikim according to a passage in the Talmud. Yakov succeeds in burning the Mazzik's face, but there's a question as to whether or not it's the Mazzik's true face. When the battle is won, Yakov returns to Reuben's corpse, which is now being contorted by the Mazzik. Yakov prays fervently now, and from memory, a big contrast to his previous boredom in just rattling off the prayers from the book earlier in the movie. This time, he really means it. He commands the demon to leave Reuben, and it does. As light begins to stream through the windows, for the first time in perhaps a very long time, Rabbi Shulam shows up with the pallbearers and repeats his invitation to Yakov to come to synagogue for morning prayer. And Yakov says, "Not today." After everything he's been through and everything he's seen, he still won't bring his pain to God. And maybe that's why, as Yakov leaves the Litvak home, we see him heading down the street. A dark shape leaves the Litvak house and shambles along the sidewalk behind him. So all of this brings us back to the support group at the start, where the main topic of conversation was moving on from the past. Yakov's return to his past faith was what freed Reuben Litvak from the Mazzik. So what gives? Do we go back to the past or do we move on? What do you do when you lose your way? You go back. You retrace your steps back to the point where you became lost. And when you get there, you might find that you dropped something important, something vital to your survival. Yakov finds what he dropped on the path, but he doesn't take it with him. At least, as he tells Rabbi Shulam, not today. The Vigil did a great job of portraying Hasidic Judaism's traditions, rituals, and beliefs in an accurate way, but more importantly, in a way that showed a lot of care and a lot of heart and soul and great poignancy, not only related to the Jewish faith, but to the human condition in general. And I really, really want some filmmaker to do that same thing for the Roman Catholic demonology and exorcism tradition at some point, instead of all of the sensationalistic garbage that we get in exorcism movies focusing on the Catholic Church all the time. I hope you've enjoyed this discussion of The Vigil, and if you've seen the movie, let me know in the comments what you thought of my analysis, and if there was anything that you noticed in the movie that wasn't mentioned in this video and that you would like to discuss. As always, thank you so very much for giving my video some time of your day. Hope to see you for the next one.